and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. My name is Brian Allman. Remember to visit gemstatechronicle.com for all my work, as well as breaking news, press releases, and guest editorials. Subscribe for free, or support my work at gemstate.substack.com. Also, be sure to check out this month's sponsor, Boise Realty Group, and Realtor Lynn Bradescu. Thank you, Lynn, for being a long-time sponsor of this platform. Last week, I wrote a short article about how Britain's approval of euthanasia demonstrates that the big debate for the rest of this century is going to be about identity. I want to expand on that idea today. Strap in, this is going to be a long ride. I recently watched a series of videos about the history of party politics in America by an author and YouTuber named Frank DiStefano. DiStefano says we're in the fifth party system, and many, including Frank and I, believe that we're going through another major realignment. DiStefano argues that each party system begins with a new great debate in America. In most cases, the debate is resolved by a synthesis of the best ideas from both sides. Once it's resolved, politics enters a period of torpidity before a new issue arises that provokes a new realignment. I'll post the whole series of videos in the show notes, but here's the gist. The first party system between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans saw a debate over how the new nation was going to be run. The Federalists generally wanted a strong central government, while the Democrats wanted to protect states' rights. The resolution came when the Democrats adopted many of the Federalist ideas, leading not only to the rapid expansion of the United States, but essentially to a one-party system for several years. During the so-called era of good feelings, James Monroe ran for his second term as president unopposed. One elector cast a vote for someone else simply to keep George Washington as the only unanimous president in history. The second party system began with the rise of Andrew Jackson, who took the Democrats in a more populist direction. This era saw the elimination of property requirements for voting and increased settlement of the West. Henry Clay and the Whigs became the primary opposition, advocating for slower settlement and against the Mexican War. Whigs wanted to implement the moral ideals of the Second Great Awakening, including the abolition of slavery. Eventually, the Whigs fell apart in the 1850s, mostly due to disagreements over slavery. The third party system saw the birth of the Republicans, who were devoted to ending slavery and fulfilling America's manifest destiny. The Civil War ended the Democratic Party for a generation, but it was reborn in big cities full of new immigrants. New York's Tammany Hall became a powerful Democratic Party machine, connecting immigrants from Ireland and Italy and Germany to resources and jobs in return for their votes. The third party system grew stale into the 1880s and 1890s as the old debates over the Civil War and Reconstruction faded in the face of industrialization and the closing of the West. In 1896, the Democrats embraced the populist movement, while the Republicans embraced the progressive movement, setting the stage for the fourth party system. During the first third of the 20th century, Democrats were mainly populist. They appealed directly to the people against the elites, while Republicans were progressive, entertaining ideas about how to use modern technology and new fields such as political and social sciences to improve the lives of the American people. This is why it's a mistake to apply modern labels and concerns to the past. How do you apply the word conservative to the administration of Teddy Roosevelt? You might find a few old Democrats that you could potentially call conservative, but the label just doesn't work because we're trying to understand it through a modern lens. The fourth party system broke down in the face of the Great Depression, and FDR's New Deal fused populism and progressivism into a new democratic liberalism. These Democrats believed that big government was the solution to every problem in America, whether economic or social. The Republicans were nearly wiped out by the New Deal. In 1937, following Franklin Roosevelt's absolute steamrolling of Alf Landon in the Electoral College, Republicans were down to 18 members of the U.S. Senate. Yet a new conservative resurgence grew in opposition to the New Deal. Conservatives said that government was too big, that America needed to roll back many of the New Deal programs lest we go the way of communist Russia or fascist Italy. The fifth party system has been characterized ever since as a clash between conservatism and liberalism. However, many of the actual issues that were debated in the beginning of that system have been left behind. Each party system was built on myths, whether they were true or exaggerated. The first system was built on the revolution itself. Both Federalists and Democratic Republicans appealed to the imagery of the revolution to depict themselves as its legitimate heirs. Both sides in the Civil War saw themselves as following the example of the founding generation, with Northerners seeing themselves as protectors of the Union our founders created, and Southerners saw themselves as following the example of rebellion and self-determination. Even today, all sides appeal to the memory of the Founding Fathers, though the left's iconoclasm and outright hatred for our shared heritage is increasingly difficult to resolve. Our current party system is built on numerous myths, such as the heroic Franklin Roosevelt saving America from the Great Depression, then leading us through a war against tyranny, after which we established a new liberal world order. This new order reached its zenith with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, at which point historian Francis Fukuyama said that we'd reached the end of history. The end of history implies that there can be no further development, no evolution in politics, whether at the international level or in national politics. Obviously, his premise was incorrect, and our political system was not immune to the forces of history any more than the geopolitical situation. I suggest that our fifth party system, that of the conservatives and liberals, started breaking down during the Obama administration. One characteristic of late party systems is that the parties become less distinct from each other. They reach a consensus on issues that once provoked fierce debate. Few Republicans have campaigned on ending Social Security. Instead, Republicans compete with Democrats over who will better protect Social Security for generations nearing retirement age. Few Republicans are campaigning on rolling back Medicare or the other programs of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. It seems that the welfare reform compromise between Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich in 1995 took entitlements off the table as an issue. Indeed, much of the debate between the two parties had narrowed to just a few big issues by the 1990s. The New Deal and the Great Society were entirely off the table. Free trade and increased immigration were embraced by both parties. Senator Edward Kennedy pushed the 1965 Immigration Act that opened our borders to the world, and rather than repeal it, Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty in 1986 that not only institutionalized mass legal migration, but incentivized illegal immigration as well. The Reagan Revolution saw a mini-party realignment as conservative Democrats like John Connally of Texas came over to the GOP. However, the existing conservative-liberal paradigm continued into the 21st century. Many of the issues that once divided Republicans and Democrats had become verboten. For example, both sides had accepted endless foreign entanglements as well. It's easy to forget that the Democrats were the war party for much of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson took us into World War I, and Franklin Roosevelt into World War II. Harry Truman took us into Korea, and Lyndon Johnson took us into Vietnam via the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In 1968, both Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey wanted to end the war properly, with honor, rather than cutting and running, and leaving our South Vietnamese allies in the lurch. It was only by 1972 that Democrat George McGovern adopted an extreme anti-war position. By the 1990s, both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were deploying troops to the Middle East, and by the 2000s, both Republicans and Democrats mostly supported the global war on terror. It wasn't until the Iraqi Civil War of 2007 that establishment Democrats really started coming out against the war. Nevertheless, Obama ran in 2008 as an anti-war candidate, but once in office he expanded the war on terror to Yemen, Syria, and who knows how many other places. Donald Trump was really the only political figure to seriously call for withdrawals in the 2016 primary. And beyond that, he called the Iraq War a mistake. He said George W. Bush lied about weapons of mass destruction. This was heresy to old guard Republicans, but it helped Trump stand out as a maverick who wasn't bound to previous GOP positions. Much of the opposition to Trump from within the party has come from old guard Republicans who can't stand that Trump has been butchering their sacred cows. The original debate of the fifth party system was over big government, and while both parties kept playing the roles they were given, it really stopped being a driving issue over the past 20 years. Bill Clinton said in 1995 that the era of big government was over, yet government kept growing. Republicans continued to campaign on cutting government, yet government kept growing. Despite small differences, Republicans campaigned on ending abortion and Democrats campaigned on banning guns, both parties generally supported free trade, increased immigration, foreign intervention, and increased government spending. The end of Bush's term morphed seamlessly into the beginning of Obama's with relatively little change. Is it any wonder that so many establishment Republicans from the Bush era, including his own Vice President Dick Cheney, supported Kamala Harris this year? Party realignments occur when the two parties from the previous system reach an impasse where they no longer represent the people of America. In the 1880s, both Democrats and Republicans were still arguing about the Civil War and Reconstruction, oblivious to how industrialization and the closing of the West were changing our country. Today, there's a populist movement rising that sees the two existing parties as enslaved to the same corporate interests. This populist movement popped up on both the right and the left, with Occupy Wall Street expressing leftist frustration with corporate bailouts and wealth inequity, while the Tea Party was an outlet for conservatives who were frustrated with big government and crony capitalism. The two movements were prevented from a natural alliance, in my opinion, by their built-in mistrust of the other. Left-wing populists saw conservatives as tools of big business, not to mention racist and sexist and all the other ists that our public school system calls people on the right. But right-wing populists saw occupiers as whiny hippies who need to grow up and get jobs rather than complaining about not having enough money. Populists on the left still believed that government was the solution to the problems created by big corporations, while populists on the right still held to the idea that the free market would fix everything. Meanwhile, the two parties continued doing the same things they'd been doing. Democrats continued expanding free trade, mass migration, and foreign wars under Obama, who was prepared to pass the baton to Hillary Clinton to continue the same policies. Republicans paid lip service to opposing Obama's agenda, but continued funding all his major policies and prepared to nominate Jeb Bush for what was meant to be a show campaign in 2016. Many Tea Party populists had rallied around Ron Paul in 2012. Though they failed to win the presidential nomination, they did grab hold of party infrastructure throughout the country. Idaho's Republican platform planks of repealing the income tax and returning to the gold standard are artifacts of the Ron Paul Revolution. A lot of that libertarianism found a home within the conservative movement over the past 10 years. The occupiers rallied around Bernie Sanders, the independent and quasi-socialist senator from Vermont. They too failed to win the nomination, with many believing that the DNC rigged the primaries to favor Hillary Clinton. Despite the rise of so-called democratic socialists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the core of the Democratic Party remains firmly under control of the establishment. Corporations, so hated by the Occupy protesters, rebranded with rainbow colors for gay pride and black squares for George Floyd, and were suddenly beloved by the left. Skepticism of big corporations, once a core tenet of the left, shifted to the right. Conservatives had spent generations supporting big business, only to see them sell out to wokeness. Republican boycotts might not have bankrupted Bud Light, but it was a sea change in how we on the right treat business. This growing conservative populism found its ultimate expression in Donald Trump. Unlike the right in 2012 or the left in 2016, this movement succeeded in putting its man in the White House and completely taking over the Republican Party. This, I believe, triggered a realignment, not unlike the one at the turn of the 20th century. It's a realignment that is reaching its peak as we speak right now. Prominent conservative pundits and politicians, many of whom I'd describe as neoconservative, declared they could not possibly support Donald Trump. Many of these had spent the previous decade warning about the catastrophe that a Hillary Clinton administration would bring, but they would rather give her the election than allow a right-wing populist to win. National Review, the news magazine founded by William F. Buckley in the 1950s that came to define movement conservatism, published an entire issue called Against Trump. That might have been enough to turn the tide in 1980, or even 2010, but it could not stop what was coming in 2016. Trump not only spoke out against the global war on terror, he said that George W. Bush had lied to get it started. He disparaged the record of John McCain, yet he still won McCain's home state of Arizona. He denounced NAFTA, the free trade agreement beloved by leaders of both parties, and said that he'd put an end to mass migration, promising to build a wall on the southern border. Trump demanded that NATO members pay for their own defense rather than riding free on the American dime. And, of course, he promised to put an end to the endless military adventures promoted by both parties. In short, he was shooting sacred cows left and right, and in doing so he tapped into a new constituency. Trump himself recognized the realignment that was happening before our eyes in his first inaugural address. Let's listen.
What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
It didn't stop there. The COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates brought about a change in perspective in Republican voters. We opened our eyes and discovered that it was big tech that was censoring us on social media, hand in hand with government intelligence agencies. It was private hospitals that were forcing employees to take an experimental injection or lose their jobs. It was the U.S. military, once the exclusive domain of the right, that was doing the same thing. It was police departments that were arresting moms for going to the park or parishioners for praying outdoors, enforcing the ridiculously unconstitutional mandates of local and state governments. Finally, the 2020 election woke many up to how so much of the game has been rigged. The last 10 years have seen a series of escalating filters on the right. Many were knocked out due to Trump himself, while more fell during COVID, believing that lockdowns were morally acceptable and the government had the right to ban the unvaccinated. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was another filter, knocking out those old guard Republicans who never got over the end of the Cold War. The new GOP that came out of these crucibles was very different from the one that nominated Mitt Romney for president in 2012. The conservative populist movement has now nominated Donald Trump for the Republican presidential nomination 3 consecutive times. The last time one person won 3 consecutive nominations on a major party ticket was Franklin Roosevelt, who was nominated and won 4 straight times from 1932 to 1944, in the midst of a party realignment. Despite the wishes of old guard Republicans like Mitt Romney, the GOP is not going back to its pre-Trump ways. This realignment is happening whether you like it or not. Many of the old guard Republicans, especially the neoconservatives whose top priorities were foreign wars, open borders, and free trade, have migrated to the Democratic Party. Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris. January 6th committee star Adam Kinzinger campaigned for Democrats in the Midwest. And once conservative outlets like National Review continue to attack Trump, even after he won re-election on November 5th. On the other hand, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert Kennedy Jr., Bill Ackman, Elon Musk, and many more who once called themselves Democrats enthusiastically supported Trump this time around and are being rewarded with seats at the table. I think a lot of people are waiting, expecting this whole thing to blow over and go back to normal. I'm afraid that's not going to happen. There's no such thing as normal in American politics. Normal is just what you're accustomed to, but every moment in our political history is just a blip in time, a transition from one thing to another. I'm sure the Tories in 1776 were hoping that everything would go back to normal once the Patriots got a little rebellion out of their system. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams hoped that the Andrew Jackson phenomenon would be a flash in the pan and soon things would go back to normal. In 1900, when William McKinley was re-elected, many hoped the populist and progressive movements would fade away and things would go back to normal. Republicans in the 1930s and 40s hoped that one more election would send America back to the pre-New Deal normalcy. Establishment Republicans in the 1960s hoped Barry Goldwater's landslide defeat would return party politics back to normal, but they were unprepared for Ronald Reagan. Establishment Republicans in the 2010s hoped to return to a Reagan-era normalcy, but were unprepared for Donald Trump. Someday, we're going to look back on this era and hope that whatever new issues we face will fade away and we'll return to the normalcy of the Trump era. Frank DiStefano says in his videos on the political systems in American history that every new system is about a new great debate, a big question that needs to be resolved before America can move on. Realignments occur when the existing political and party system is unable to answer the new questions that have arisen. So all that said, what is the question we face today that's causing such political turmoil? I suggest it's a question of identity. Who are we? Who are we as Republicans? Who are we as conservatives? Who are we as Idahoans? Who are we as Americans? Who are we as human beings? There was an exchange in a Republican primary debate last year between Vivek Ramaswamy and former Vice President Mike Pence that I think explains this question perfectly. Ramaswamy, a millennial, said that he believes Americans are in the midst of an identity crisis, and that the next president needs to restore an idea of what it means to be an American. Pence dismissed that idea, saying that the American people are already great and don't need any help. Let's listen.
We're in the middle of a national identity crisis, and I say this as a member of my generation. The problem in our country right now, the reason we have that mental health epidemic, is that people are so hungry for purpose and meaning at a time when family, faith, patriotism, hard work have all disappeared. What we really need is a tonal reset from the top, saying that this is what it means to be an American. Yes, we will stand for the rule of law. Yes, we will close the southern border where criminals are coming in every day. And yes, we will back law enforcement because we remember who we really are. And that's also how we address that mental health epidemic in the next generation that is directly leading to violent crime across this country.
Governor DeSantis, really quickly. Governor DeSantis.
We don't have an identity crisis, Vivek. We're not looking for a new national identity. The American people are the most faith-filled, freedom-loving, idealistic, hardworking people the world has ever known. We just need government as good as our people.
Well, Mike, I think the difference is you might have, some others like you may have on the stage, it's Morning in America speech. It is not Morning in America. We live in a dark moment, and we have to confront the fact that we're in an internal, sort of cold cultural civil war.
And we have to recognize the American people with the failed government in Washington, D.C. We just need government as good as our people again.
So let me just finish addressing that slogan.
I believe that Mike Pence perfectly represents the old guard Republican position here. He doesn't want to talk about the problems facing the American people. Rather, he just wants to repeat slogans and shibboleths about American exceptionalism and faith and freedom. He refuses to recognize what people my age and younger can plainly see, that the American identity has become muddled, diluted, made meaningless. Neoconservatives created this idea that America was just an idea, and that anyone on Earth could become American simply by changing geography. They act as if we live on magic dirt, and that Italians, Haitians, Somalis, Koreans, whomever, can become just as American as anyone else simply by moving here. That's obviously absurd, but many conservatives have deployed this argument for fear of being called racist. The question we face is not only who we are as Americans, but what is America? Is it a piggy bank for the world? Is it a tax farm for globalist NGOs that want to use our money and power to reshape the world in a woke liberal image? Is it a giant flea market where the world can engage in trade? Or is it our home? Is it our inheritance? If America is just an idea, then what exactly is that idea? Is it some vague feeling of patriotism? Is it the idea that anyone can become Americans? Is it the idea that GDP must always go up? If America is just an idea, can we deport anyone who doesn't believe in that idea? There's this globalist conceit that all human beings are interchangeable cogs in a giant machine that produces GDP. Their measure of success is that lines on the graph go up, no matter the standard of living for Americans living in, say, Springfield, Ohio, or Charleroi, Pennsylvania. If 50,000 Haitians under temporary protected status can work the factory for cheaper than the Americans whose grandfathers once had good jobs there, then so be it. If 35,000 illegal aliens in Idaho can milk cows for cheaper than American teenagers, so be it. The only purpose any of us have is to make the line go up. It's not a racial issue. Vivek Ramaswamy is a second-generation Indian. Elon Musk was born in South Africa. Tulsi Gabbard is of Polynesian ethnicity. America's always been something of a melting pot. The founding stock were descended from England and Scotland, and many early immigrants came from Ireland, Germany, and Italy. In many cases, each group retained some sense of its own ethnic heritage, yet there was something they all bought into, something that made them uniquely American. What was that? Was it an idea? Young Republicans like Vivek Ramaswamy recognize that the American people have an identity crisis, and a new generation of leaders needs to address this. Old guard Republicans like Mike Pence are whistling past the graveyard, and just hoping we can go back to the early 2000s when conservative Americans rallied around tax cuts and foreign invasions. Democrats, of course, are on a completely different planet, denigrating white people, men, Christians, and anyone else not part of their minority coalition of the fringes. They've fully embraced the concept of the citizen of the world, not only erasing American identity, but actively working to erase American heritage as well. It's gone beyond just tearing down statues of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln to rewriting history books and recasting the story of America. This new great debate is not only about who we are as Americans, but who we are as human beings. Are we autonomous, made in the image of God? Do we have inherent natural rights? Or are we interchangeable cogs in that machine I mentioned earlier? Or are we representatives of some interest group? Men, women, homosexuals, transgenders, whites, blacks, Hispanics, disabled people, etc.? Your worth in the eyes of the left is not in your individuality, but in your membership of a group. And of course, they believe that some groups are superior to others. That debate extends further. Do we have inherent dignity as being created in the image of God? Or are we numbers on a spreadsheet, detritus to be deleted once we consume more than we create? Are we male and female, with unique and complementary characteristics? Or are we blank slates that can become anything on a spectrum of gender, as long as we have the right drugs, surgical procedures, and of course laws to force people to call you by your chosen pronouns? Are the unborn human beings with the right to life? Or are they clumps of cells that can be discarded for the convenience of the would-be mother? Do we as a people deserve freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of movement? Do we have the right to a heritage? And do we have the right to pass that heritage on to our children, to continue our nation? Do we have the right to defend ourselves when others, especially those in more favored groups, mean to harm us? Do we have the right to speak our minds and to share our opinions in public or on social media? This debate continues, even to things like technology. How do devices like smartphones, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence relate to the human experience? What's going to happen when people start demanding rights for AI? What about as people become more integrated with technology such as Neuralink? We're just beginning to ask questions about these things, much less come up with answers. And the old political and social systems are completely unprepared for the transformations we face over the rest of the 21st century. Our task is to figure out where we stand amidst these questions, amidst this grand political realignment. Old labels and coalitions are increasingly meaningless. What then does it mean to be conservative in the 21st century? In the wake of the Great Depression, conservatism meant small government, stopping and even reversing the excesses of the New Deal, and returning to a pre-1930s paradigm between government and the citizen. In the 1940s, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio led the conservative wing of the GOP, calling to undo the New Deal, or at least stop it in its tracks, while Governor Thomas Dewey of New York led the moderate wing, which wanted to make the New Deal programs more efficient and run them better for the American people than the Democrats had been doing. That same dynamic played out for basically the rest of the 20th century. Conservative Republicans wanted to reduce the size and scope of government, while moderate Republicans accepted that government had grown and wanted to restrain the new programs, claiming they'd run them better than the Democrats who'd created them. When Republicans won presidential elections, it was often with compromise candidates who appealed to both wings of the party. Eisenhower in 1952, Nixon in 1968, the first George Bush in 1988. Eisenhower called himself a conservative progressive, or was that a progressive conservative? Either way, he had a successful administration by finding a third way between the two partisan factions. Now, conservative Republicans were unhappy with the Eisenhower administration in many areas. I think conservatives today could conceivably argue that Republicans squandered their best chance to roll back the New Deal and head off the oncoming Great Society, but they blew it through compromise. But that's the nature of living in a republic. Elections have consequences. You have to win to implement your ideas. The Taftites definitely considered Ike too moderate, too willing to compromise with the left. Phyllis Schlafly wrote her book, A Choice Not an Echo, in an attempt to wrest control of the GOP away from the liberal Eastern establishment, which she believed had controlled men like Dewey and Eisenhower. Their new champion was New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, while conservatives rallied around Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was the conservative dream candidate in 1964. He's everything we say we want in a candidate. He was uncompromising, unashamed, and willing to say what he believed with no filter. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. Goldwater lost one of the biggest landslides in American history, which illustrates the perpetual conundrum of the American Republic. No matter how right you are, how strong your principles, you still need to win election to put them into practice. Sure, standing up against the world and holding firm on your convictions feels good, but it doesn't matter in the end if you don't achieve anything. Too many conservatives while away the years asking, what if? What if our candidate had won? What if we stopped this or that program? What if things were different? Well, things are what they are, and this is the world we must deal with. Even when self-proclaimed conservatives won the White House, as with Reagan in 1980 and George W. Bush in 2000, they often ended up governing closer to the center than we'd like to think. All Republicans today speak highly of Ronald Reagan, but in 1980 the moderates hated him, saying he was too extreme. Nevertheless, Reagan governed like a moderate in many ways, such as when he signed amnesty for illegal aliens in 1986. That same year, he signed a gun control bill that further limited citizens' rights to bear arms. George W. Bush followed a similar trajectory. In addition to getting us into Afghanistan and Iraq, Bush signed Medicare Part D and campaign finance reform. He was in the middle of attempting another amnesty for illegal aliens at the end of his term, but thankfully that failed. At some point in the late 20th century, the conservative platform of undoing the New Deal became obsolete. Eisenhower didn't roll back the New Deal, and by Nixon's administration, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society was resting on top of the foundation laid by FDR in the 1930s. Even though conservatives today still pay lip service to the idea of reducing government, how many are going to publicly call to repeal Social Security or Medicare? Most Republican candidates today run on protecting Social Security, because the retirees who benefit from the program are very active voters. Heck, Republicans couldn't even repeal Obamacare in 2017, despite campaigning on that for 8 years. Now, does this mean I suddenly love big government? Of course not. I'm just trying to explain that 8 decades of Republicans running on a small government platform has not made any meaningful reduction in the size and scope of government. Few candidates can campaign on cutting spending, cutting entitlements, or any other reduction of government and hope to win, because like it or not, the American people are addicted to the handouts that come with big government. So what then does conservatism mean in 2025 and forward? Where do we go from here? At the national level, our deficits continue to rise out of control, and the national debt has reached $36 trillion. Reagan didn't reduce the debt. Bush didn't reduce it. Not even Trump reduced the national debt. Ironically, the only time in recent memory that the federal government ran a surplus was during the Bill Clinton administration. The Republican Congress, led by Newt Gingrich, forced Clinton to come to the center on issues such as spending and welfare reform, something that doesn't happen when you've got a Republican in the White House. Reining in the national debt was once a top platform for Republican candidates like Bob Dole and Mitt Romney, who, as you know, lost their races. Few people today outside of Rand Paul and Thomas Massie talk about the issue anymore. The American people don't seem to care. We've been told for generations that our deficit spending would lead us to catastrophe, and it hasn't happened yet, so we've tuned out. That's not to say the rising debt isn't a problem. Of course it is. The conundrum we face is that running on a platform of reducing the debt is a non-starter in a modern American discourse, so people have simply stopped doing it. So again, we ask, what is conservative in this new political party system? It's almost a category error in itself, like asking what color rain is or what does sadness taste like. It's like asking what's a conservative in the era of Teddy Roosevelt. The era of big government was not over in 1995, despite what Bill Clinton said. Rather, it had so metastasized that it was as normal to us as water is to fish. Now, time will tell if Donald Trump and Elon Musk can actually cut spending and cut the government over the next few years. But the last century has not shown any progress on that front, no matter the plans or promises of candidates and politicians. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with conservative principles. Of course, I want smaller government. I want to get back to the system where government did not micromanage our businesses and our lives. The question is, how do we get there? Who decides what specific policies are conservative here in the 21st century? Consider the COVID Pause Act, a bill in the Idaho legislature a couple of years ago that not only would have ended Governor Little's state of emergency declaration, but would have restricted private businesses from imposing vaccine mandates on employees. Many conservatives, operating purely on first principles without regard for the current paradigm, could have conceivably called that improper government interference in private enterprise. Is that a conservative idea or is that a libertarian one? Where do you draw the line? What's the difference? Is there a conservative case you can make for protecting the rights of employees even though it's a private business? Over the years, outlets like National Review and formerly respected pundits like David French have developed a reputation for penning the conservative case for whatever is the latest degeneracy pushed by the left. Somehow, in their twisted perspectives, conservative principles require acquiescence to drag queen storytime, transgender surgery for minors, blessing gay marriage and supporting gay couples buying babies via surrogacy, not to mention endless foreign wars and free trade, open borders, allowing big corporations to run roughshod over our natural rights. French, who professes to be a Christian conservative, or is that a conservative Christian, has written that child drag shows in public libraries are one of the blessings of American liberty, but he also says it's wrong to have public school children read the Bible. With conservatives like this, who need liberals? Perhaps the most ridiculous application of this perspective was when Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson vetoed a bill to protect children from genital mutilation surgeries. He justified his veto by saying that the party of Ronald Reagan should not be interfering in private medical decisions. I still get angry at him for that. He had the chutzpah to run for president in this year's primary, finishing with 0.1% of the popular vote. Like Mike Pence, Hutchinson is a Republican from a different era, and was wholly unprepared for the problems we face in the current year. Every Republican legislative candidate calls him or herself a conservative in Idaho. What does that word mean when it's claimed by everybody from Heather Scott and Scott Herndon to Britt Raybould and Jeff Schroeder? English political philosopher Robert Conquest is famous for his laws of politics, one of which says that everyone is conservative about whatever he knows best. For example, J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter books, went from radical feminist, so radical that she retroactively made a character gay just to appeal to the far left, to an apparent right-wing conservative because she refuses to accept that men can become women. Everyone has something about which they are personally conservative. The original idea of conservatism in the American political system was a reaction to the New Deal, but that was almost a century ago. Now, people who support welfare and high regulation and aggressive foreign policy can call themselves conservatives because they want to conserve the political system of the past 80 years. Brian Lenny wants to crack down on illegal immigration in Idaho, a problem that's been growing for generations, while Stephanie Mickelson defends a long tradition of farmers and dairymen hiring foreign workers. Which position is, by definition, conservative? Libertarians oppose government programs such as E-Verify, claiming their intrusions into private enterprise and risk giving the government too much information about our private lives. Yet many conservatives support such things as necessary for enforcing our laws and protecting American citizens. Consider the question of illegal drugs. Conservatives have long held that certain substances should be prohibited for the good of society. At best, marijuana drives people toward laziness and neglect, and at worst, it could have serious side effects. Is that reason enough for the government to ban it and maybe even throw users in jail? We tried prohibiting alcohol once upon a time, but changed our minds and repealed the 18th Amendment. What is the conservative stance on drugs? Libertarians, who, following the Ron Paul revolution, have injected a lot of populist energy into the Republican Party, say it's not the government's business what we choose to put in our bodies. Indeed, go back to 1784 and tell our founding fathers that in 2024 federal agents can bust down your door and throw you in chains because you're smoking a plant. You might end up tarred and feathered. Yet conservatism is clearly more than just individual rights. We have to look at society as a whole. Is society helped or harmed when drugs like marijuana, or worse, are legal and freely available? Is it a good environment in which to raise the next generation? Whereas libertarians believe that people are all free moral agents, individuals who make decisions for themselves in a vacuum, conservatives have historically believed that society must put up certain guardrails to protect people from their own worst excesses, and also to nudge people in the right direction for the benefit of society as a whole. But in 2025, who decides what that right direction is? Another odd issue is the grocery tax. Many of Idaho's strongest conservatives have been pushing for years to eliminate the sales tax on groceries. With more conservative lawmakers this coming session than ever before, people are expecting action on this issue. Now, obviously, removing any tax anywhere is something that most conservatives and libertarians will support. But why the grocery tax specifically? One prominent conservative recently told me that we should support eliminating this tax because it's regressive, impacting the poor more harshly. And, since everyone needs to eat, it's also become a moral issue. I pointed out that the argument about it being a regressive tax is actually a left-wing position, but this didn't faze that activist. Indeed, the traditional conservative position regarding taxation has been to support flat taxes, in which all people pay the same rate. That's not to say that eliminating the grocery tax is necessarily a bad idea. Rather, it's not one that has been traditionally conservative. That's the nature of a political realignment. Ideas that were once considered beyond the pale for one party or the other are now being seriously considered. If you'd asked a conservative Republican in 2003 about which planks he'd want to build a solid conservative platform, you'd likely hear about supporting the troops no matter what, keep government out of business, opposing abortion and gay marriage. What a far cry from the new and victorious coalition of President Trump, which rejects foreign wars, supports reining in big business, and has already seen Roe v. Wade overturned, leaving the abortion issue to the states. Tell that same person in 2003 that vaccine skeptic Robert Kennedy Jr. would be running Health and Human Services, Democrat Tulsi Gabbard would be running our intelligence agencies, and that the American people had firmly rejected Liz Cheney. He'd naturally assume that Democrats had won the 2024 election. Social issues, which are key to the question of identity that we're just now starting to discuss, were once considered off-limits by prominent conservative thinkers at the turn of the century. Republicans believed they'd lost the culture war, and they'd come to terms with that situation. They wanted to forget the social stuff and focus entirely on dollars and cents. Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign was entirely about the economy, yet he lost. Why? In the early 2000s, some conservatives made timid attempts to push back against the growing tide of wokeness. They passed laws defending traditional marriage or requiring people to use the proper bathrooms, but they often backed down when big corporations threatened boycotts. Old guard Republicans like Mike Pence seemed more afraid of corporate backlash than of alienating Christian conservatives. As governor of Indiana, Pence vetoed a religious liberty bill under pressure from big business. Now he's taking half-hearted shots at Trump's new cabinet, a team that he's obviously not part of this time around, using social issues as his angle of attack. The one thing that Republicans consistently excel at is talking tough when they're out of power and don't have to follow through on their promises. It's contradictions like this that crippled the old GOP. They claimed to support traditional Christian values, but would do nothing to promote them using government power. You see, they adopted this false idea that we can have a neutral public square. Even when the secular culture began imposing a vision that was directly contrary to those values, they did nothing, for fear of being called authoritarians or Christo-fascists. Even today, there are some who claim the mantle of conservative who shy away from using government to promote anything. Obviously, the left doesn't have this problem. See the display of debauchery on the White House lawn for Pride Month a couple of years ago. Yet many on the right still operate in this fantasy world where the public square remains neutral and non-ideological. The implicit assumption of libertarians and these old guard Republicans is that culture doesn't matter, identity doesn't matter, that human beings are interchangeable cogs. This ideology also assumes that it doesn't matter what you do to human beings. Transgender hormones and mutilating surgeries? Oh, so long as it's a consenting adult. Terrible food and debilitating pills? Just a part of modern life. Families constructed of 2 dads, 2 moms, or some sort of polyamorous web? Well, it's still family values. Old guard Republicans like Mike Pence are like cargo cultists, assuming that the system will continue no matter what so long as they keep repeating the old lines about American exceptionalism. Yet America will not remain exceptional if we forget what made it so in the first place. And that's why I'm optimistic about this ongoing party realignment. Only time will tell what kind of success the new and improved Republican Party will have, both politically and in making America great again. I believe these are positive developments, though. The political system that came out of the New Deal and World War II has become frozen, ossified, unable to handle modern problems. We're going to need some serious discussion and serious debate about how to apply our timeless principles to this modern era. Shibboleths and bumper sticker slogans won't do the job. In the late 1800s, as the third-party system had become frozen and corrupt, politicians increasingly looked back to the Civil War as a source of identity and motivation. Eventually, these appeals became tired and stale, and those figures were accused of waving the bloody shirt rather than addressing real issues. How many Republicans continue to wave bloody shirts today, looking back to debates about the national debt, welfare, or 9/11, rather than taking seriously the concerns facing younger generations of Americans? That exchange between the boomer Mike Pence and millennial Vivek Ramaswamy perfectly encapsulates this problem. In the context of the fourth turning, we entered a crisis period around 2008. These periods typically coincide with those party realignments. We should be coming out of that crisis period by the end of Trump's second term. What will that world look like? Will our national debt finally implode our financial system? Will we finally have the political capital to end or at least significantly reduce entitlements? Will the deep state Leviathan have been tamed, or will it still thrash uncontrollably on the shores of our society? I have no idea. The only thing I'm sure of is that we need to be open-minded about new strategies to implement those timeless principles. Tying ourselves to a specific ideology or a specific set of policy prescriptions, and then denouncing anyone who disagrees as not conservative, is a surefire way to lose the momentum we've gained. We must resist the temptation to go the easy route and fight the last war all over again, rather than confront the realities of the 21st century. The question of who we are, as Americans, as Idahoans, as human beings, is the question we're going to have to figure out. But to do that, we're going to go through uncharted territory. To quote a great American hero of yore, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. This has been the podcast of the Gem State Chronicle. Make sure to subscribe or follow the Chronicle on whichever platform you prefer, and I'll see you next time.